Opiates, opioids, and the problems they cause are in the headlines daily, but this drug's use actually started thousands of years ago. This week, we enter the era of modern drug treatment with the introduction of methadone. Drug historian Dr. David Courtwright, who personally knew its first champions, is here to tell us about the advent of medication-assisted treatment. And now, DrDrew.com presents the history of opium. Part 7. Who is responsible for treating the addicts? The era following the passage of the Harrison Narcotic Act in 1914 was all over the map with regard to the handling of addicts. Up to that point, they had relied on physicians to lawfully prescribe opiates, but the looming threat of lawsuits and criminal action resulted in the vast majority of the medical community's refusal to provide opiates. The law was further crystallized in 1919 when the Supreme Court decided in Webb v. the United States that prescribing drugs to keep addicts, quote, comfortable did not fall into the parameters of the physician's exemption as outlined in the Harrison Narcotic Act. So prescribing to addicts was strictly illegal. Predictable, many addicts resorted to unlawful activities. Meanwhile, physicians were fraught with fear and confusion over how to deal with longtime patients who are now regarded by the law as criminals. Again, we made similar mistakes in the 1990s and 2000s, but going the other direction. Some doctors were being arrested as others were having their cases thrown out. The dawn of the Prohibition era in 1920 added another wrinkle to the landscape when the manufacture, transport, and sale of alcohol was rendered illegal. Amidst all the legal chaos, a well-respected physician in Seattle named Dr. Charles Linder was indicted after he prescribed a small amount of opiates to an informant during what essentially amounted to a sting. Ultimately, his reputation was restored when his conviction was overturned in Linder v. the United States, 1925. The Supreme Court found that it was legal for a physician operating in good faith to prescribe narcotics to ease withdrawal symptoms, a reversal of the previous interpretation. In 1930, though, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was established, this within the Department of Treasury. Harry J. Anslinger was appointed its first commissioner, largely credited as the architect of early American drug policy. Anslinger would head the Bureau for the next 32 years. He was a controversial figure who favored strong punishment for drug offenders and championed the notion that marijuana was the gateway drug that led to other addictions. 1930s, where that conversation began. During his tenure, he led the charge towards tougher laws, such as the Boggs Act in 1951, which put harsher mandatory sentencing on the books. World War II disrupted the international heroin and opium trade, and as a result, the American government was temporarily able to tighten its grip on the distribution of drugs within the United States.
Doctors Vincent Dole and Marie Nyswander were the pioneers of methadone maintenance in the early 1960s. And Nyswander had been involved in drug treatment for a long time. She had, in fact, studied at or trained at Lexington when she was a young physician. And then she had worked in East Harlem. She had been involved in abstinence-oriented treatment. She'd written a book, The Drug Addict as Patient. Dole's involvement was serendipitous. Lou Thomas at the Rockefeller Institute had simply asked him to take some time aside from his work on metabolic diseases and start looking into this large and growing problem of narcotic addiction in New York City. And he agreed to do it. And then he teamed up with Nyswander. And Dr. Dole began what he described to me as humdrum observational research. So they had drug addicts on a ward, and they would experiment with different drugs. So they would try morphine, or they would try heroin, or Dilaudid, or whatever, and they tried methadone. And Dole noticed a difference. He noticed two things. One, when he maintained these patients on methadone, they weren't constantly asking him to increase the dosage. And the other thing he told me that he noticed is that they weren't obsessing about drugs. So when he just tried to maintain people with morphine or something like that, a shorter acting narcotic, they were all talking about drugs. When am I going to get the next shot? Who's got the best dope out on the street? When he put them on methadone, they started talking about baseball. They started talking about their families, their hopes to go back to school. They started talking about sort of normal things. And from that, he gained the insight that there was some potential there for long-term rehabilitation. And then, of course, they went on to write up their research in the Journal of the American Medical Association. It was published in 1965. The idea caught on in New York City, which had a very serious heroin problem in the late 60s. And eventually, as you know, it caught on with the Nixon administration, which got behind methadone maintenance expansion in the early 1970s.
During this period in Nazi Germany, however, none other than Hitler himself may have been reliant on a mix of opioids and cocaine to keep him up. In his 2017 book, Blitz, Drugs in the Third Reich, author Norman Ohler claims that Hitler's doctors regularly dosed him with an opiate called Dilantin, meperidine, this is now Demerol. He bolsts this claim with reports of several witnesses who were present when Hitler fired his physician, yelling, quote, "You have been giving me opiates the whole time. Get out of the bunker and leave me alone." Meanwhile, back in the U.S., the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was claiming that addiction was no longer a significant problem. By the end of the 1940s, however, the sentiment disintegrated with a rise in heroin use. In Chicago, for instance, the drug was popular amongst young African Americans who were part of the jazz music scene. At this time, high-quality heroin was relatively cheap, and its addicts were not considered delinquent. The increase in addiction rates followed World War II and led to the establishment of Riverside Hospital in New York in 1952. This facility was dedicated to treating drug-addicted adolescents. It appeared to have all the makings of success. It offered a multidisciplinary approach that featured hospital-based treatment of heroin addiction. The patients were cared for by devoted medical staff, social workers, teachers, clergy, volunteers, vocational rehab. There was psychotherapy, educational classes, cutting-edge medical treatments. Like so many programs and treatments before, however, this one failed as well. 97% of its participants returned to addiction. This thoughtful and comprehensive approach to treating addiction brimmed with potential, but its failure demonstrated the long-term challenges inherent in treating addiction. This hospital program was just one of many that proved that sustaining recovery is more difficult than previously thought. Follow-up programs are cost-prohibitive, labor-intensive, and, of course, had at that point no 12-step mutual aid component. This is another mistake we continue to make today. There are free services available that are required after the initial enrollment and treatment is completed. After the end of World War II, United States intelligence made an important discovery in some scientific material that was confiscated in Germany. This particular cache contained documents that outlined the development of a long-acting synthetic alternative to morphine. Eli Lilly bought the drug to market in 1947 under the name Dolafine, and this would soon find lasting use as a withdrawal treatment in the U.S. market, known as Methadone. Methadone's use as a long-term maintenance for opiate addiction was spearheaded by Dr. Marie Nyswander and her husband, Dr. Vincent Dole. Nyswander had recently published, quote, The Drug Addict as Patient in 1956, and advocated the idea that addiction should be treated as a medical problem. During the course of treating addicts, this pair discovered that despite its addictive qualities, methadone had fewer negative side effects than other opiates. They also noted a reduction in problematic behaviors associated with shorter-acting opiate addiction.
Doctors Vincent Dole and Marie Nyswander were the pioneers of methadone maintenance in the early 1960s. And Nyswander had been involved in drug treatment for a long time. She had, in fact, studied at or trained at Lexington when she was a young physician. And then she had worked in East Harlem. She had been involved in abstinence-oriented treatment. She'd written a book, The Drug Addict as Patient. Dole's involvement was serendipitous. Lou Thomas at the Rockefeller Institute had simply asked him to take some time aside from his work on metabolic diseases and start looking into this large and growing problem of narcotic addiction in New York City. And he agreed to do it. And then he teamed up with Nyswander. And Dr. Dole began what he described to me as humdrum observational research. So they had drug addicts on a ward, and they would experiment with different drugs. So they would try morphine, or they would try heroin, or Dilaudid, or whatever, and they tried methadone. And Dole noticed a difference. He noticed two things. One, when he maintained these patients on methadone, they weren't constantly asking him to increase the dosage. And the other thing he told me that he noticed is that they weren't obsessing about drugs. So when he just tried to maintain people with morphine or something like that, a shorter acting narcotic, They were all talking about drugs. When am I going to get the next shot? Who's got the best dope out on the street? When he put them on methadone, they started talking about baseball. They started talking about their families, their hopes to go back to school. They started talking about sort of normal things. And from that, he gained the insight that there was some potential there for long-term rehabilitation. And then, of course, they went on to write up their research in the Journal of the American Medical Association. It was published in 1965. The idea caught on in New York City, which had a very serious heroin problem in the late 60s. And eventually, as you know, it caught on with the Nixon administration, which got behind methadone maintenance expansion in the early 1970s.
Methadone and other opiates, like heroin, work by binding to the mu opioid receptor in the brain. Methadone is taken as a pill or liquid. It's absorbed rapidly, but has a delayed onset. It is metabolized by the liver and released slowly into the bloodstream. When taken regularly, it prevents unpleasant withdrawal symptoms. Methadone has a half-life, meaning the amount of time it takes to reduce the drug's presence in the body by half, of approximately 28 hours. This means that once daily dosing can be used to maintain effective levels for extended periods of time. Opponents of high-dose long-term methadone maintenance therapy argue that the treatment is merely replacing one addiction with another, which is true. Dr. Nyswander and Dr. Dole, however, argued that a, quote, harm reduction approach to treat addicts was preferable to dying of addiction. They also were concerned that continuing to provide people with shorter-acting opiates would result in continued problematic behaviors. They believed that the indefinite high-dose methadone treatment was the most realistic goal for many of their opiate-addicted patients, and that health and behavior survival really was what mattered, not the absence or presence of opiates. They advanced the idea that methadone maintenance was an acceptable alternative to complete abstinence. The narcotics farm in Lexington, Kentucky, which previously was mentioned, also favored methadone as withdrawal treatment. Not so much for maintenance, though. They used it for withdrawal, which it is a good treatment for. Many addicts claim that methadone has changed their lives for the better. The medical community's use of it as a long-term, quote, cure, however, really goes at the heart of what it is we are aiming to achieve when we treat addiction. Proponents of the method believe it's a viable option. People live better lives and live longer, but critics argue that it's just another instance of physicians fueling the seemingly endless cycle of opiate abuse. Iatrogenic, or physician-caused addiction to opiates, is a recurring theme in the history of the United States, and one that you must pay attention to. It's important to understand. The big issue with methadone really is that to take enough to suppress the behaviors and the pursuit of other opiates, you essentially are so sedated and so sort of down-regulated that you can't function interpersonally. It's hard to work. It's hard to get off the couch. Now, if you can get the dose down low enough, some people do find they can function, but they can never really do the work of recovery, which we'll learn about later. Be sure to check out Dr. David Courtwright's upcoming book, The Age of Addiction, How Bad Habits Became Big Business, in which he expands his exploration of addiction to include those associated with food and the digital realm. His book will be published by Harvard University Press and available in May of 2019. I want to thank our staff at Doctor.com, particularly Michelle Poe, for pulling this opium series together. And you can read our entire series and all of our weekly medical articles at drdrew.com. If you join the email list, you get it automatically. Please do tell a friend. We appreciate it. Pass it on. Well, CBDs are everywhere, right? Everyone's talking about them, and it's a topic that I get asked about all the time. Bottom line on CBD, although there are way more claims made about them, the clinical evidence right now, it's not all that clear, but many people are using it and reporting great results, and they are very encouraging. So I want to first define exactly what I'm talking about here. CBD is cannabidiol, an extract from hemp. While you might associate with marijuana, CBD does not cause reinforcement. It is not the reinforcing component of hemp, but it is what's responsible for the calming or some of the relaxing effects that many people experience, not the high. Now about the products. There are a ton of them on the market today. For getting the vast array of the reported health benefits, it's important to be aware of what you're buying. I was recently introduced to a company called Select CBD, an Oregon-based company that focuses on high-quality ingredients and manufacturing standards, not the hype. Their CBD-based products are available in a wide range of formulations and flavors, each of which is described to you so you can make an informed decision without all those promises that are probably too good to be true. Like I said, the reported benefits of CBD by individuals using this are very compelling. I'm excited to see how things develop as the science catches up with this booming industry. As usual, the public is ahead of the science. I can't make explicit claims yet, but boy, the reports are pretty encouraging. So if you're ready to try CBD, I encourage you to check out Select CBD. To learn more, go to drdrew.com/select. That's on my site, drdrew.com/SELECT. And for a limited time, you can save 25% at checkout with the code DRDREW, DRDREW. Again, drdrew.com/select, and then the code DRDREW.